The other group of 300 people was given to the Apostolic Church of Pentecost of Canada, and that's the group that Brother George Nielsen started his work with. And so Sister Simmet had really done a wonderful work and was greatly used of God, and later, some years later, she came back to Kerala and she worked in Travancore with my father and mother in a Bible school program. She started a Bible school and did quite a little training in a Bible school ministry in Travancore for a while.
No. No.
That's enough for just now.
Okay.
Sister Simmet also had a co-worker when she came to teach in our Bible school by the name of Sister Lillian Tutt. That was spelled T-U-T-T. Sister Tutt was a very slender and tall lady, and she and Sister Simmet worked together for some time, operating this Bible school in Adur village for the training of our workers. Later on, Sister Simmet went to Kodaikanal and she rented a house there and stayed there for some time. But she certainly was a wonderful blessing and played a very important part in the very early beginning of the oneness work in South India. So my father then started with this group of 300 people, and Brother Nielsen had his 300 in the Canadian church. And these two men were very different in their outreach, vision, etc. Brother George Nielsen concentrated most all of his effort on the state of Kerala, or which was then known as Travancore. He was very interested in the literature ministry, and he bought a Heidelberg press and established an excellent printing plant in Kottayam. He also built a very nice headquarters in Kottayam and had a very nice work in Kerala state. But his work did not really spread very much beyond Kerala. Most of the work that Brother Nielsen did was in Kerala, and that was where his interest was. He learned the Malayalam language, he spoke it quite well, and my father's case was different. My father had a vision for all of India, and while he started his work in Kerala state, eventually as doors opened, he went to other parts of India. The first other part of India that he really got involved in was Northeast India, because there was another missionary by the name of Sister Teely Dover who was working up with Mother McCarty in Bhagalpur, and Teely had wanted to be a part of the missionary work of the United Pentecostal Church before she ever came to India. But Brother Stairs, for some reason, was not willing to give her missionary appointment. So she came on her own to India. I am told that when she arrived in Calcutta, she arrived wearing an Indian sari. And she was met by Brother James Murar from the Bharosaghar mission in Bhagalpur. Brother James at that time was a single young man and very outstanding. He had been to America. He was an excellent preacher. And some have thought that perhaps Sister Teely was hoping that there might be some romantic attachment with Brother James Murar, but it didn't work out that way. And so Teely was working there in the Bharosaghar mission, and she came to know about this revival movement in Mizoram, which then was called the Lushai Hills. And she had some contact with Brother Zakamlova. So Sister Teely had this contact with Brother Zakamlova in the Lushai Hills, and she was then in touch with my father and it was planned in 1950 that she would travel along with my father and brother Nathaniel Permar to Ijal to visit these revivalists who had experienced an unusual working of the Spirit in the Lushai Hills. My father made this long trip from Calcutta by train around what they then called the Assam Link. That was going clear around the nation of East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh. It was then East Pakistan, and they had to take this long journey by train until they finally got to Silchar. And then in Silchar, they took the convoy, the military convoy, up into the mountains. The roads were terrible, and there was only one-way traffic, so they went by convoy, one way, traffic at a time, stopping at gates and letting the other traffic pass. And finally, after 2 long days, they arrived in Ijal, and there my father met with Brother Zakablova and other members of this revivalist movement. And that was the beginning of our work in the Lushai Hills. There's a lot to be said about that, but at this point we are just mentioning that my father from the beginning had a desire to spread the work throughout India. So whenever he had opportunities or invitations, he would go into new states. For example, he went to the state of Andhra, and he opened some work in the Telugu field. And then when he had a chance, he went to other parts of India. But the result was that the work grew and expanded from a small beginning in Travancore state until it went to many other parts of India. And by the time he left India, the work had grown from 300 to 30,000 in the nation of India. Now we are going to talk a little bit about our beginning in Travancore. After Fern and I had finished our first semester of school, then it was time for the vacation when we could go down from the hills to be with our father and mother on the plains. So we went then to Adur. Of course, Mom and Dad came up to the hills and they took us down in their vehicle, in the Jeep. So we got down to Travancore in the village of Adur, where they had rented a house by the roadside. Most of the people there, many of the children, had never seen white people before. So we became quite an attraction to the whole community. And of course, every morning the children would be going on their way to school. Seemed like hundreds of them. And we were living in this house right by the roadside. So they all wanted to come and surround our house and look at us and see what we were doing. And my bed was out on the porch. They called it a veranda. It had bars, just bars, no windows, no glass panes. So hot there. So usually in the morning when I would wake up, there would be brown faces looking through the bars all around that porch, that veranda, looking at me. And they would be giggling and laughing and saying, "Saiba, Saiba." And then, of course, this became a daily affair. These children going to school and coming home again would come by our house and want to see how we were living and what we were doing. And when we would go out into the meetings in the villages, sometimes they would come up and pull my sister Fern's hair because she had kind of blonde reddish hair. And they'd never seen anybody with any kind of hair except black hair. And they couldn't imagine. They'd pull her hair to see if it would come off because they thought it must be false hair. And there were times when they would come up and pinch us to see if our skin felt like theirs did. Many of them had never seen white people before, never been around them. So these were all interesting experiences we had. And of course, in those days when you would drive along or whenever they would see you, the children would shout, "Saiba Madama, Saiba Madama." And that was just a common thing that they would shout when the white people would drive along. Well, one time we got our bicycles. Fern and I both had a bicycle. And she, in the heat, got so tired, I told her that I would pull her with my bike if she would ride. So I fastened a rope onto her bike and I pulled it with mine. I pedaled hard to pull her bike, and when the Malayalis saw that, they laughed and they laughed and they laughed. They thought, this is the strangest thing. Saib is pulling Madam. They said Madam should be pulling Saib. They thought that she should be pulling me instead of me pulling her. Of course, the man in South India, we found out, was indeed the head of the house. And when husband and wife would walk along, we're talking about some of the experiences we had when we first went to Travancore. Fern and I came from boarding school in Kodaikanal down to Adur with Mom and Dad, and we were quite an attraction to the people in Adur village. They hadn't been around white people. Many of them had never perhaps seen or been close to white people ever in their life. So they surrounded our home, and they were looking through the windows constantly and wanting to touch us and feel us, and they would pull Fern's hair to see if it was real hair because it was a reddish blonde. They'd never seen anybody with hair that wasn't black. And so we had a lot of interesting experiences as they would shout Saiba Madama when we went along, and I was telling how that one day I pulled Fern with my bike. She was on her bike and I fastened a rope to mine and to hers, and I would pull her because it was so hot and she would get so tired. And the Malayalis thought that was so strange because Saib was pulling Madam, but Madam should have been pulling Saib. And I remember well one day I heard some shouting taking place, and I asked one of the interpreters, what was all that noise? And they said it was a procession. So with my father's permission, I went with one of the Indian pastors. His name was Brother George. And Brother George took me out to see this procession, and for the first time I saw a communist procession. There were hundreds and hundreds of people walking down the main road, and they were shouting, "Aikya Munani Zindabad, Aikya Munani Zindabad," and waving the flags of the hammer and sickle. And I asked, what does that mean? And they said that means a successful revolution, a successful revolution. So the communists were trying to overthrow the Congress Party and set up a communist state in Travancore. And in fact, later, actually, we were told that the communists might commandeer our Jeep. They might take our Jeep to use in their political effort. They never did do that, but we were afraid they might try to do that. Well, these were all experiences we had, and as children coming down to be with Mom and Dad, of course we learned to wear the Indian dress. I wore the mundu and juba. The juba was the long shirt that I wore with the mundu and the second cloth. And then Fern not only wore the sari, but she wore the chata, which was the type of blouse that the Indian women had. And of course my mother sometimes dressed in the sari as well. And my father, I can remember my father dressing in a munda and juba. And so we just tried to learn more about the Indian customs and ways, and started eating their food with our fingers. And of course we would go to homes and they would spread out the banana leaf, and that would be our plate. And cut it from the tree, wash it carefully, and then put it down for our plate, and put rice and curry right on the banana leaf, and then we were to eat with our fingers. They never they never gave us any knife, fork, and spoon. So we learned to eat the food with our fingers. I've got to stop a minute, Stan, and drink some water. Eventually, my father and mother had an opportunity to purchase a bungalow in Adur on about I believe it was a half-acre of property. And they got this for a very good price. So when we came down from boarding school, we went to this new bungalow, and it was much more off the main road. There was more privacy there. It was a much larger bungalow and fixed up very beautifully, and we were just thrilled with this bungalow that Mom and Dad got. They eventually, or first of all, I believe they rented this, and then eventually they were able to purchase. But we are still using that same bungalow today. And of course we have built up many other buildings on the same property, but that bungalow, which was purchased then, has now been a part of our mission compound for many, many years. It was in this bungalow that there was a severe electric storm while we were in Adur. Sometimes the rain, during the rainy season, and there are two main monsoon seasons in Kerala State, and during these rainy seasons, at times there are very, very heavy electric storms, and these electric storms can be quite dangerous. So it happened one night. There was a very severe electric storm, and by that time it was already dark. The lightning was flashing and there was thunder. And my sister Fern had made a big mistake in that she was ironing clothes on the back veranda of our bungalow during this electric storm. Well, the electricity struck our house, and when it did, it came right down through that iron and knocked her to the floor. And she screamed and fell on the floor. So we went rushing to her to try to get her up off the floor and to a bed. We picked her up, which was no small undertaking. We picked her up and got her to a bed. And while we were getting her to a bed, there was a scream from the kitchen. And the cook, whose name was Asir, he was from Kodaikanal. Asir was, during this electric storm, he was working in the kitchen. And he had a tea kettle on the old iron stove. And he was pouring water from the tea kettle into a cup. And the lightning hit the chimney and went down through the iron stove, through the tea kettle, and knocked him to the floor. And Asir was so scared, and he shouted and screamed and fell on the floor. And some others went running into the kitchen and got him, lifted him up, and took him out to his quarter where he stayed just outside the bungalow. And that was a night full of excitement. And of course, after Fern had rest and all, she recovered and she was feeling all right by morning. Well, early the next morning, Osir, early in the morning, got up. He was so scared from what happened. He wanted to get out of Adur as fast as he could and go back to Kodaikanal. He didn't even come to my father and ask for his pay or anything. He just packed his things and left. And my father used to say that he went over the wall. He actually did that. He just climbed over the wall and got away from us as fast as he could because he was so frightened by that electric storm. But we heard at different times how the electricity can be very dangerous. In Kerala, the lightning storms are bad. And then, of course, you also have to be very careful in India because the voltage is 220 volts, while we in America usually have 110 volts. In India, it's 220 volts, as it is in so much of that part of the world. And often people in India do not realize the danger of electricity. I used to hear in Kerala, Travancore, about lines, electric lines falling down in a storm, a line across the road. And a villager would see that line there and would go up and try to move it, grab a hold of it, couldn't let loose. He was electrocuted. And then people would see him and see that he couldn't get away, and they would go touch him and try to pull him away, and they would get electrocuted. There were times when 2 or 3 or more people would die just because they did not know what electricity was all about. But electric storms can be very severe and very dangerous in Kerala state, Travancore state in South India. Life was so interesting there, with all kinds of unusual things happening in Kerala. One time, Brother George Nielsen took me to a village with him on Sunday morning. And after the Sunday morning service, why, they wanted to serve us food. So these were very poor people, and they put out the banana leaf and put our rice on the banana leaf. Well, the rice was full of ants. Ants had gotten into the rice, and it was just full of ants. Now, what do you do when you're the guest of people and your rice is full of ants and they put a little curry there with it? Well, I was not about to eat that rice full of ants, and we just showed it to the people, all the ants. And when they saw that, they didn't expect us to eat that. And so that was no problem. They were embarrassed and felt bad about it, but we could not eat it, and they didn't expect us to eat it once they saw the ants there. They were very sorry that that had happened. But we had a lot of different experiences in eating with people in Kerala state. I noticed they put salt on the banana leaf. And first I didn't understand. I thought that was just for taste. But somebody explained to me that salt is more than just for taste. If you eat salt in anybody's home, they said that means that you will never bring harm to that home. That is kind of a tradition, that by eating salt, you will never bring harm to that home where you were enjoying that meal.
Okay.
As a young person in India, surrounded by Hindus and Muslims and people of other religions, I had such a desire to know more about the Indian culture. And I knew that religion and culture were closely associated. I also knew that language and culture were closely associated. I studied a little of the Malayalam language in Adur. My father arranged for a Pandit who lived there, who was a Brahmin, to come to our home and teach us Malayalam. So we studied Malayalam right there in our Adur bungalow. This Pandit would come and he taught us how to write the language. He brought little little bamboo sticks that they used to write the Malayalam, and they taught us how to write, taught us how to read. So we tried to learn a little bit of the language, and then I wanted to study something of the history of India. I've always enjoyed history, so whenever I had a chance to get some books of Indian history, I would try to buy books and read a little bit about the history of India. And of course, it was then that I found out there was a big difference between, for example, the Malayali people of Travancore and the Tamil people just on the other side of the mountains. Though these people are not far apart geographically, they are very far apart culturally. And I found out that the old Tamil culture of India is one of the very, very rich cultures of the south, of the Dravidians. And the Tamils are proud of their culture. And I came to realize that there is a great deal of feeling between the Tamils and the Malayalis where culture is concerned. And apparently this is not only true between the Tamils and the Malayalis of Travancore, but it's true throughout India. India is a land of many cultures and many tribes, and often there is feelings. And so to try to bring peaceful coexistence between all these different kinds of people is indeed a challenge, and I think that's one reason that I have appreciated the government of India in its effort to try to have a government that would meet the needs of so many different kinds of people with all of their languages and cultures and ways of living. But back to learning more about culture, I wanted to learn something of the Hindu religion. So I came to know that there was a priest in Andur who had a little temple up in a high spot where often the temples are. So I went to meet this priest. I went to his temple, and he was very kind to me. He spoke some English, and I asked him questions about his idol that he had there and his worship, and he tried to help me understand. Of course, he was very defensive of the Hindu belief and what he was doing. But the thing that made a great impact on me by that visit was this. He gave me a little booklet. And oh, how I wish I had that booklet today. The name of that booklet was Why I Accept Christianity But Not Churchianity. And I took that booklet home with me, and I read through it very carefully. And this little booklet was saying that we cannot find any fault in Jesus Christ. We can accept him. We do accept him. We accept his teaching. But we cannot accept churchianity because as we observe Christians and their ways of doing things, we feel that they are so far removed from the teachings of Christ. They are not really living as Jesus taught people to live. And there is so much taking place among Christians that is not proper. Lying and cheating and doing things that Jesus taught were not proper. They were sinful. But you see these things being practiced among the followers of Jesus. So, as just a young person, it gave me a bird's eye view of how some people outside of Christianity view us. They could not find any fault in Jesus. In him there is no fault. But they could find fault in the followers of Jesus because they were not practicing what Jesus taught them to do. Well, we were living then in a state of Travancore where there is probably the highest percentage of Christians in India. And many of the Christians in Travancore are not born-again Christians. Most of them are not. And many of them were certainly living lives far removed from the way Jesus taught us to live. And it's well understandable why people in other religions could view what they saw of Christianity in Christians and say that they did not really want to have a part of this. This is the reason why in a nation like India it's so important